Hopefully, Blair, you can see the presentation and I'll turn it over to you now.
Yes, I can, and thank you very much. And just to confirm, maybe with a thumbs up, you can hear me okay?
We can.
Good, perfect. Well, thank you all very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak this morning. And I'm going to focus on climate change and extreme weather risk. Is Canada prepared? And if not, what needs to be done? Or state it a little more graphically, if you look at the pictures on the slide, when things occur due to expressions of extreme weather risk occur along the lines of that which you see on the slide, upper left-hand corner, too much water in the wrong place at the level of the community, causing community level flooding, down to and including flooding within the locality of a few houses on a street, and ultimately, let's say, water ending up in a basement and causing flooding and creating the lamentable situation you see presented here. When this type of event occurs, is Canada prepared? Are we preparing as a country to not see the realization of this type of event going forward? And by the way, I'm going to focus mostly on challenges pertaining to too much water in the wrong place, flooding, but that's not to say that there aren't lots of other climate change, extreme weather risk problems out there. We have flood, drought, fire, wind, hail, snow load, permafrost loss, sea level rise. There's lots of things that can and are going wrong in reference to climate change and the expression of extreme weather risk, but I don't have time to go into all of them. So I'm going to focus disproportionately on flood risk in the country, number one. And the second reason for doing that is that the most expensive expression of climate change extreme weather risk in Canada is by far flooding, and particularly residential basement flooding along the lines you see in the lower left-hand corner. And then second to that, by the way, is fire risks for homes, businesses, communities in forested regions. So, but most of my discussion will focus on water risk and efforts to mitigate that risk, and I'll mention a few other types of risks as we go along. Next slide, please. If we could have page down, just the next slide.
We're trying, Blair. Just hold on a sec.
Well, while you're doing that, I'll just talk about what would be on the next slide, which is the agenda. And effectively, what I'm going to focus on over the course of the next 30 minutes or so is point number one, by way of agenda, is to make the point that climate change is real and effectively irreversible. I think with this audience, you probably don't have to work too hard to convince people that climate change is real and that human induced. But I can tell you for sure, and speaking to a lot of audiences across this country, there are a lot of people who aren't convinced that climate change is even real, period, never mind human induced. And also, climate change is effectively irreversible. It is here to stay. We're not going backwards on climate change. That doesn't, if you could just stay on the agenda slide. Now go up one. So effectively climate change is real and it's irreversible. So I will drive home that point. And number two, the costs of climate change are going up, and I will depict this increase in costs as illustrated through increases in the catastrophic loss insurable claims being realized in the country. And points 1 and 2 on the agenda, as you see here, I can tell you at first, this is going to be a little bit depressing. This isn't an uplifting part of the presentation, but things turn the corner a little bit on point number 3 when I make the point that for Canada, we have not been sitting on our hands in reference to preparing for climate change extreme weather risk. We've done a lot of work in the country over the period of, I would say, the last 5 or 6 years to develop new standards and guidelines to mitigate various forms of risk: flood, fire, hail, wind. And I'm going to illustrate some of the advances we've made in the country to address flood risk at the level of the home, new community design, existing communities, commercial real estate. And then I'm going to drill down on what can we actually do at the level of the home? What could we operationalize in Grey Bruce County to mitigate flood risk at the level of the home and to lower the probability that people end up with a flooded basement. So that's where we're going to head. Next slide, please. I just want to double check. I'm still on the agenda slide. Is that correct? So the next slide will, yes, there we go. Now, when I talk about the fact that climate change is real, basically the bottom line is climate change has occurred, is occurring, and will continue to occur. And indeed, over the course of approximately the last 100 years on the planet, or 120 years, the average temperature on the planet has increased by about 1.1 degrees Celsius. Now, when you hear that, well, the average temperature on the planet is up 1 degree Celsius, you think, well, that doesn't really sound too bad. As a matter of fact, I was explaining this a while back to my next door neighbor. I said, you know, over the course of the last 100 years, the average temperature on the planet driven by the burning of fossil fuels has increased 1 degree Celsius. And she said, well, that sounds nice. Not realizing that the change in temperature on the planet today versus an ice age is about 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. So given that reality, being up 1 degree Celsius over the short period of time of 100 years due to the burning of fossil fuels is a really big deal when you consider the fact that the difference between what we have today and an ice age is 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. And by the way, this elevation in temperature over the last 100 years due to the burning of fossil fuels, this isn't just my cavalier opinion. This is the opinion enforced by or endorsed by and expressed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, in 4 or 5 publications they released between 2010 and pretty much 2020. And then more recently, in the report that you see on the slide, Canada's Changing Climate Report 2019, which was authored by a large number of climate scientists working primarily for Environment Canada, where in that report they said, and I'll read the part on the right, and it's in quotes because I took it, or it's in italics because I took the material directly from the report. They said, the Earth has warmed during the industrial era, so more or less the last 120 years. Only when human influences on climate are accounted for, which means the burning of fossil fuels, can these observed changes in climate be explained. This warming is effectively irreversible. So what we should be doing to address climate change, of course, is working with great haste to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, to not put more carbon emissions into the atmosphere than necessary. We should be working on carbon capture and sequestration to take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it safely to help limit ongoing climate change. We should certainly be doing those 2 things, and I consider both to be highly important. But here, I'm going to focus on the 3rd leg of the stool of how to address climate change. That is adaptation to extreme weather risk that's on the ground now and that which is coming in the future. But by focusing on adaptation, I don't mean to suggest that the other 2 points aren't important, but there's a lot of people working on those files. So here, I'm just going to focus specifically on adaptation and more specifically, adaptation to flood risk. Next slide, please. So now many people, you may have the perception that, for example, when you were younger, and depending on your age, I suppose that would be dependent, but if you go back 30, 40, 50 years ago, a lot of people have the perception, they think, you know, that the storms we're getting today compared to 30 or 40, 50 years ago, the high intensity rainfall or precipitation events, they seem more extreme today than they did in the past. And the question is that perception real? And the answer is yes, it is. What you're looking at here is obviously the United States, and you're looking at changes in the intensity of extreme precipitation events. The top 1% of extreme precipitation events, how intense are they over the time, or what change have we seen in that intensity over the period of about the last 50 to 55 years? And what you're looking at here is data from the US National Climate Assessment. And what's notable, particularly in the area where we live, is you can see that towards the western end of the Great Lakes, over the period of the last 50, 55 years, the intensity of the top 1% of precipitation events, in other words, big storms, has increased by 37% towards the western end of the Great Lakes and by 71% towards the eastern end. So when you have the perception that the severity of storms today seems more severe than would have occurred 50 years ago or when you were younger, your perception is actually based in reality. And by the way, the data that you see here for particularly the area surrounding the Great Lakes would certainly be applicable in our area. The precipitation events don't care where the Canada-US border is. So certainly precipitation is getting more challenging as a function of time. Next slide, please. Now, what do the costs of climate change actually look like? So we've seen the extreme precipitation, but how does that actually manifest itself in terms of elevated costs for the country? And what you're looking at on this slide as a function of time, in the lower left-hand corner, we have 1983, and we come up to pretty much the present 2019. And the bars, or the histogram, or the gray bars on the file, they show, they depict catastrophic loss insurable claims as presented on an annual basis. And in insurance terms, a catastrophic event is any event like a flood, fire, hailstorm, windstorm, whatever it might be, that causes more than $25 million in damage. That's classified as a catastrophic insurable event. And then a group here in Canada called CAT-IQ, working with the Insurance Bureau of Canada, they add up all these numbers on an annual basis, these catastrophic events, and plot out the total costs. And what in billions of dollars. So what you can see is from the period of 1983 up to about 2008, the catastrophic loss insurable claims in the country were in the zone of approximately $250 to $450 million a year. That's how much the insurers could count on paying out for flood or fire, wind events, or whatever it might be in over that time frame. But things started to change from 2009 onward, whereby for 10 out of the last 11 years, the catastrophic loss claims went over $1 billion per year, every year for 10 out of the last 11 years, for an average cost of about $1.8 billion. And by the way, all the data that I'm showing you here has been corrected for inflation and for per capita wealth accumulation. In other words, if you were insuring twice as many homes today as you were 10 years ago, you would expect that with nothing going on, that the claims today would be twice as much as 10 years ago, just because you're insuring more homes. So all of the effects of inflation and per capita wealth accumulation has been factored out of this data, so that horizontally we're looking at a comparison of apples to apples. And you can certainly see that from 2009 onwards, things are becoming increasingly problematic for the costs associated with extreme weather events. The factor that's driving most of the upward bend in this curve for Canada, that explains about 60% of it, is too much water in the wrong place. Flooding, and in particular residential basement flooding. So that's the elephant in the room of challenge for the country. And by the way, it's not just climate change that's driving this increase in cost. We also have, for example, here in Southern Ontario, we have the loss of over the period of the last 100 years of about 72 or 73% of the natural infrastructure that was originally here, fields, forests, and wetlands, that's now been either paved over or turned into some form of agricultural development. And in the cases where you pave over and have agricultural development, when the big storms hit, the water tends to not stay on the landscape very long. When it hits pavement, runs off very quickly to the lowest point around, which quite often is someone's basement, and that contributes to flood risk. We also have aging municipal infrastructure. We have aging housing infrastructure. We've got a lot of things that are going wrong, or going in the wrong direction, that drive the upward bend in the curve here. But certainly climate change is a major contributor, the more intense storms, to the events we see here. And it's at the point that, as per the bullets in the upper left-hand corner, the home insurance premiums have increased about 20 to 25% over the last 5 years in Canada. And about 60% of that increase is due to flooding. The amount of insurance coverage you can get for your home when your basement floods, that limit is coming down, the cap limit on that, into the $10,000 to $20,000 range from what used to be higher. This is problematic because the average cost of a flooded basement in our region, in Ontario, for example, is about $40,000 to $43,000. So if someone has a flooded basement with that cost the average $43,000, and assuming they had a $10,000 cap limit on their insurance, that would mean they're on the hook to pay the additional $33,000 to bring their basement back into working order. And by the way, this is particularly problematic for a great many people who simply, A, don't have $33,000 sitting around at a moment's notice, and B, when a basement floods, it is non-negotiable that you have to correct that problem rapidly, or you have to move out of the house. If you have a flooded basement on a Monday morning, and that's mostly sewer water, which is really nasty stuff, you have to fix the problem by Wednesday of that week, or you have to move out. So lack of insurance coverage is problematic. And then on the final point here, and remember at the beginning I said none of this is going to make you feel good. We actually have a trend in Canada now from literally Halifax to Victoria, whereby increasingly so people can't get insurance coverage for their homes in towns and cities across the country at any level of premium. They can get fire and theft coverage, but I'm just talking about water, where they actually can't get coverage for flooding in their basements at any level, simply because the probability of flood risk is so high and the ensuing damage that the premiums would be logarithmic. It'd be like paying 3 mortgages on your home. So the problems associated with flooding are certainly getting more dire and challenging going forward. And then if we could have the next slide, please. What I previously talked about were the financial costs associated with basement flooding. But there is also a psychosocial or a mental health cost associated with basement flooding as well that we're realizing just over the last few years. And for example, and I'll just describe it, story first, and then turn to the chart, which illustrates my point even more so. But we at the Intact Center, we went to a community that was realized very heavy flooding in 2014 in Burlington, Ontario, so just a little bit west of Toronto. And in August of 2014, Burlington experienced an event over a 6-hour period of about 190 millimeters of rain over 6 hours that resulted in major flooding in the community. They had about 3,300 homes were flooded out, basements flooded, and which for a town the size of Burlington was a lot of homes. We went back to Burlington 3 years after this flood occurred, not 3 weeks later, not 3 months later, but 3 years later. And we ran a survey of residents, homeowners on some streets whereby people experienced flooding, and next street over they might not have been flooded, or we had homes on a street that flooded versus those that weren't flooded. And in this survey, we basically asked the question, we asked them a lot of questions, but what it came down to is, how stressed do you feel as a homeowner every time there's a major precipitation event, a major storm? And the bottom line is that for 48% of the respondents that had experienced flooding, they ranked themselves as a 4.5 to 5 out of 5 in terms of the amount of stress they feel, with 5 being the maximum stress every time there's a precipitation event, versus people that hadn't been flooded. Basically, the stress they felt during a major precipitation event was negligible. So the psychosocial stress associated with basement flooding is dire, and people would make statements like, if there's a major storm during the night, my husband and I are up 3 times during the night checking for water in the basement. Or the kids come home from school, and the first thing they do if there's a major storm that day is go down to the basement when they get home to see, do we have flooding? So this is a reality that people live with for a long time. We have found that the average period of time that people miss from work when they experience a flooded basement is just over 7 days, or that was the case in Burlington. And that is a claimable incident for the life and health insurers, not the property and casualty insurers that you saw on the previous slide with basement flooding and fixing the damage. But lost time from work is a life and health insurance claim. So they would make claims for lost time from work. And now what we're looking at, we don't have the data yet, but what we're looking at, the final data, but we're looking at the effect of basement flooding on elevations and prescription medications to deal with mental health stress and counseling services for people that experience these events. So the point is, overall, The challenges associated with flooding in the country are severe, they're dire, and they're on the increase. Now, that's all the bad news. So what's the good news? And let's perhaps please turn to the next slide. So in Canada, over the period of about the last 5 or 6 years, more or less, we have been doing a lot of work to mitigate flood risk. We've been doing, by the way, a lot on fire, wind, and hail and ice loading, but here we'll just, for time purposes, stick to water. And what you're looking at here are the covers of standards and guidelines that have been developed to guide flood risk mitigation in the country at various levels. So for example, in the upper left-hand corner, this guideline focuses on actions that individuals can take around the outside of their property and then in the basement itself, i.e. at the level of the house, actions that can be taken to lower the probability that a homeowner will experience basement flooding. And I've got it in the dotted line box there because I'm going to explain this one in a little more detail in a few slides. But we've also developed very good guidance in the top row middle on how to build new residential communities in such a way that when the big storms hit, the homes in the communities aren't flooded out. And by the way, the we that I'm referring to here, it's a collective effort of the National Research Council, Standards Council of Canada, Canadian Standards Association, certainly the Intact Center in there in the middle of all this. And generally speaking, for every report that's developed or presented on the slide here, we end up bringing about 50 to 100 subject matter experts together to provide guidance as to what should go into these reports to mitigate flood risk. So it's insurers and builders and developers and financial people, conservation authorities, multitudes of NGOs, etc. Anybody who has expertise that they can bring to the table as to how do we mitigate flood risk, they're pretty much brought to the table to develop these reports. So it reflects a large collective expert view of expertise on the subject. In the upper right-hand corner, we've developed very good guidance for the country to focus on flood risk mitigation for existing communities. So when the big storms hit, how can we place and deploy ahead of the curve berms, diversion channels, holding ponds, cisterns, permeable surfacing, etc., to drive water to safe locations to keep people out of harm's way when the big storms hit, as opposed to running out at the last minute when the big storms hit and putting out hundreds of thousands of sandbags trying to hold back the water. When you see the news at night with towns and communities that are putting out hundreds of thousands of sandbags, it basically says they were not prepared. But this document provides good guidance on how do you prepare for the vulnerable regions within communities to make it such that when the big storms hit going forward, we're not all wiped out. In the lower left-hand corner, we have guidance now on flood risk mitigation for commercial real estate, tall office towers, condo towers, apartment buildings, etc. What are the measures that can be engaged so you don't have underground parking lots, amongst other points, flooding out during major storms? Bottom center, we have good guidance for the country on what we should be doing to retain natural infrastructure, the fields, the forests, the wetlands that were originally here. How can we go, why and how should we go about retaining natural infrastructure to mitigate flood risk as opposed to paving everything over, so to speak? And the return on investment, by the way, for retaining natural infrastructure is astronomical. You know, it's logarithmic in terms of not realizing flood damage by otherwise paving things over cavalierly. And and then in the lower right, we have more documentation on the psychosocial and the negative impacts of mental health stress associated with basement flooding. Now, I'm just going to focus in on when we were developing guidance on home flood protection in the upper left-hand corner. We literally went into hundreds and hundreds of homes and met with homeowners and surveyed, actions that would be engaged around their home, around individual homeowners' homes, to determine the degree to which individual homes are prepared for flood risk. And in so doing, we found the following. So next slide, please. So we looked at key factors around the outside of homes that could affect a higher probability of basements being flooded. Then we looked in the home itself, in the basement itself, to see what's the state of preparedness to mitigate basement flood risk. And then we looked at maintenance issues. And just to quickly run you through it, for the horizontal bars in horizontal histogram presented by the green bars, we're looking at the top flood risks recorded outside the home. And what we found, for example, was that downspouts, the downspout that comes off your east trough down the side of your house and hopefully directs water well away from the foundation, well, we found indeed in 78% of cases, the downspout discharge drops water very close to the foundation of the home, within 2 meters of the foundation and very often right at the foundation, which takes the water off the roof, drops it at the side of the house. The water percolates down the wall of the house, through the weeping tiles and back into the basement. In other words, we need extensions on downspouts to direct water further away from the house and not towards your neighbor's house, obviously. We found that for 69% of homes, the second bar down, that the grading somewhere around the home, somewhere around homes, we found that grading directed water towards a house versus away from it, virtually 69 or 70% of the time. Sump pump discharges. Very often people will have sub pumps in the basement of their homes that if water got in the basement, it pumps water outside. We found that for the vast majority of homes, 68%, the sub pump dumps the water right at the wall of the house. The water goes back down the side of the wall of the house, down to the foundation, into the weeping tiles and back into the basement, as opposed to discharging it well away from the house out of harm's way. In the blue bars, we looked at top flood risks recorded inside the home. We found that for people that had sub pumps, 84% of people did not have battery backup supply for their sub pump. The time you need the sub pump is when the big storms are hitting. And very often when the big storms hit, the electricity goes out. So if you don't have battery backup supply for your sub pump, it doesn't do you any good at the time you need it. So for sure you need battery backup supply. Furniture and electronics at risk of water damage, 71%. This is electronics sitting on the floor of the basement versus being elevated. Valuables at risk of water damage, 65% of homes have their key valuables, the things they cherish in life, sitting on the floor in the basement. These are things like wedding albums and child photos, et cetera, et cetera. These are the things, by the way, that when stuff goes wrong and flooding occurs, this is the stuff that literally when you're meeting with people, this is where they start crying when they're showing you the damage, the stuff that cannot be replaced. Obstruction of water flow to the floor drain, believe it or not, in about a third of homes, the little drain that's in the basement, this isn't even a climate change thing, this is just pure bad home management. In about a third of homes in the country, the floor drain in the basement, the thing that's there that if your dishwasher overflowed, or washing machine overflowed, would let the water flow out of the home. 35% of homes have the floor drain covered. It's either tiled over or otherwise occluded such that water cannot drain out of the basement. And then top self-reported maintenance flood risk inside the home. Probably many of you are familiar with we're down to the yellow bars now. Probably many of you are familiar with backwater valves. These are valves that for the drain in the basement that I just described for water to drain out of the basement. For homes that are where the storm and sanitary sewer lines are hooked up together, during major storms, water can very often back up through that line into the basement. So you can put a little valve on that line to make it such that water can flow out of the basement, but it can't flow back in. But if you don't maintain that valve twice a year, just clean it out. It takes about 10 minutes with a toilet brush, quite frankly. If you don't maintain it twice a year in the spring and the fall, the probability of that valve sealing properly and stopping water coming back up through the system is very, very low. 53% of people reported they never maintain their backwater valve, which basically means it's just a decoration in the basement. Most people, 43% of people never test their battery backup supply for their sub pump, and if indeed they have a sub pump, just turn off the power and see if the sub pump turns on based on battery supply. And most people never actually maintain the sub pump itself or check to see that it's not seized. Most people find out that their sub pump doesn't work when they have 3 feet of sewer water in the basement, as opposed to simply taking a bucket of water, pouring it into the sump well and see, does the pump turn on and pump water outside? That's how simple it is. So what we've done based on these findings and that other report, next slide, please. And I'm bringing this all down to Grey Bruce County here in 2 seconds. we've actually developed guidance for homeowners in the form of this infographic, which I've shared with the conference. Anybody can have access to this. Everything is free. So, but if we provided guidance to homeowners in the form of an infographic on the left and an app on the right that can be completed in 5 or 10 minutes. But the infographic on the left shows you in the top row, for example, things you can do around your house for $0 that can very much lower the probability of you ending up with a flooded basement. Now, for the interest of time, I'm not going to walk through them all, but just for example, in the upper left-hand corner, and particularly at this time of year, you want to make sure that either you or a neighbor or somebody in the community, if you have a sewer grate close to the house, that somebody's sweeping the leaves away from it or raking the leaves away from it in anticipation of big storms. Because what's happened, particularly at this time of year when the leaves are coming off the trees, they come down, they block these sewer grates, a big storm hits, the water can't drain away, builds up on the street and goes into the basement of someone's home. 2 years ago in Guelph, Ontario, which most people would know, they had a major storm event at this time of year, whereby under a situation whereby the leaves had not been cleaned away from sewer grates. And that storm ended up costing about $25 to $30 million in insurance claims, the vast majority of which could have been avoided if somebody had simply taken a rake or broom out to the sewer grates and removed the leaves. And then along that row, the top row, and I've already hit most of these points, so I won't go over them again. There's things like test your sub pump, that's free. In the middle row, these are items and actions that can be engaged around a house for under $250 that can lower the probability of a basement flooding. For example, just to illustrate with one on the left-hand side, for windows at grade level, at ground level, you should have plastic covers over these windows that make it such that when the big storms hit, the water can't enter into the window well and subsequently flow into the basement. The plastic covers let the light in, or if you had to escape from a basement through egress, fire or something, they can be pushed away virtually instantly. And they cost $40 per window to put one of these in place. And then in the bottom row, these are things that are just a little bit more expensive, but quite frankly, not very much when you compare it to a $43,000 basement flood. We can have in the lower right-hand corner, battery backup supply, a kit attached to your sub pump to make sure that it runs when the big storms hit. And that's about $200 or $300 that any handy person, or certainly a handyman or a handy individual, I guess is the right term, could put in place very, very simply. And by the way, the app on the right, which is downloadable at our website, the Intech Center, it basically asks you, it can be completed in about 5 or 10 minutes. It asks you a whole bunch of series of questions that can be answered yes or no, pertaining to, do you check your sub pump, yes or no, et cetera, et cetera. Basically questions along the lines of the infographic depictions you see on the left-hand side. In 5 or 10 minutes, you can complete this app and hit send, and you will get a report within minutes that identifies 5 or 4 or 10 or whatever it is, number of things that you need to do around your house to help flood protect the basement. Next slide, please. And what we're also doing, meaning we referring to the Intech Center, we are highly engaged right now in this country to get information pertaining to climate change and home flood risk out to individuals who have frontline association or discussions with homeowners who can convey, once they understand the challenges of climate change and residential flooding, they can convey best practices to homeowners as to what they should do around their homes along the lines of that which I just explained to lower the probability that they end up with basement flooding. So right now, we're running courses, a course for the Insurance Brokers Association of Canada, which represents 38,000 insurance brokers. We've now put thousands of insurance brokers through training on climate change and home flood protection to make it such that the insurance broker can sit at a kitchen table, or I guess now the virtual kitchen table, with the homeowner and have a discussion with them about things they can do around their house to hopefully avoid having a flooded basement. And we're doing exactly the same thing with the Canadian Real Estate Association. It's actually a larger number than depicted here, with about 110,000 real estate agents, educating them on climate change and home flood risk. We're doing the same training program. And by the way, these are programs that are about an hour and a half in length, 5 or 6 sessions of 20 minutes each, that these professionals can take, at the end of which they'll really understand this issue quite well to the point of conveying this information to homeowners. We're putting them all through that training program, insurance brokers, real estate agents, third one down, home inspectors, fourth one down, home appraisers in Canada. Bottom left-hand corner, for example, we're now putting 12,000 mortgage professionals, mortgage brokers through this training, so that when you go to get a mortgage for your home or renew your mortgage, you can have a discussion with your mortgage broker that is informed pertaining to how to address climate change and mitigate flood risk for your home. Just to finish off, next slide, please. Just to let you know also, nope, the other, that's too far. Yeah. So just to let you know, we have a report, we meaning the Intact Center, supported by the Standards Council of Canada. We have a report coming out very, very shortly that takes the guidance that's presented to mitigate flood risk at the level of the home, new communities, existing communities, commercial real estate, the role of natural infrastructure to mitigate flood risk, and another report that's coming out shortly on how to mitigate flood risk pertaining to sea level rise. Each one of these reports tends to be about 30 to 40 pages in length, very user-friendly, but nonetheless, all individual reports that take a little bit of time to read. We've now taken the key material from every one of these reports and put it into an integrated report on flood risk mitigation, a flood risk mitigation guideline for Canada that is going to be released in about 3 weeks. And it is super user-friendly, to the point, concise dissertation that takes the key take-home messages from all of these reports and puts them into one-stop shopping for the country. And that is useful for homeowners. It's useful for planners, developers, mayors, councillors, insurance brokers. Anybody who has an interest in not seeing flooding occurring in the country will find, I hope, this document very, very useful. So that'll be released in a couple of weeks. And then finally, the last slide, please. Sorry. Yes. So next steps. This is what I would recommend, at least for Grey Bruce County. This is very, very tangible stuff. I believe, and this is something we've done in Nova Scotia and as parts of Saskatchewan. When property tax notices are sent out, we're also now including in property tax notices the infographic you see on the right-hand side that I described earlier. This information, this infographic with the logo of the local community, whatever it might be, a town or a county or whatever it might be, this information is also going out in property tax notices. So it's an envelope that people can't sort of treat as junk mail. They have to open it because it's their property tax notice and payments for the year. This infographic is now included with property tax notices in that mail out material twice per year. And what we found, by the way, is what when we survey people that have received this information through the this form of communication, the property tax notices, and go back to them 6 months later and say, did you do anything in response to this direction? About 65 to 70% of people report that they put 1 or 2 measures in place to mitigate basement flood risk that they otherwise would not have done had they not received this material. And by the way, the cost of distributing this material is zero. It's the cost of a sheet of paper in the property tax notices. And the same information now, depending on where we're talking about, is being sent out with electricity bills to homeowners and renters, by the way. This benefits both. It's being distributed in local newspapers. And in some cases, local communities actually offer a subsidy for flood alarms or plastic covers over window wells or battery backup supply for sub pumps to further incentivize homeowners to put measures in place to lower their probability of having a basement flood. And at the end of the day, it comes down to, it is in everybody's interest to not have basements flooding. Whether you're the homeowner or the renter, you certainly don't want a basement flooding. If you're a local councillor, if you're a mayor, if you're an insurance broker or agent, if you're an insurance company, it's in everybody's interest to not have residential basement flooding occur. And there's a tremendous amount we can do very quickly, starting this weekend, along the lines of that which is depicted on this infographic. So Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Blair. Some wonderful information. We have, I think, 5 questions that have come in that I'm hoping you can run through really quickly for us. First one being, first a comment, I guess, and then a follow-up question. So certainly rainfall intensity has changed, but that is not the only change. Our landscape's ability to retain water and avoid flooding by spreading the curve has changed dramatically by the sealing and degradation of soil. And the question is, do you have numbers about the impact of land use change on flooding as compared to changes in precipitation? What are the returns to spending our dollars on revitalization, the sponge qualities of our landscapes, or on fortifying our basements and ditches? And what gives us the biggest bang for our buck?
Yeah, so that's a big question, but the answer is yes. So, but slightly more elongated answer is that we did a study, and it's on our website under reports, and I think it's actually in the report that I showed on the slides that's red in color on natural infrastructure. But we did a study for an urban area and a suburban area, and basically asked the question, if we retain natural infrastructure upstream of an urban area or a suburban area versus having it the equivalent of paved over, by retaining natural infrastructure, when a major storm hits, high precipitation event hits, like a 1 in 150 year storm, what is the change in the costs downstream realized through savings for insurable losses that are now not realized because we had natural infrastructure upstream versus built infrastructure upstream that didn't accommodate for flooding? And what we found is that in the urban area, the savings downstream were approximately 38% lowering of the costs associated with flooding by having natural infrastructure upstream versus built up. And in a suburban area, the cost savings were 29%. So the point is, natural infrastructure was in the zone of having it upstream of a flooded area or in close proximity of saving for when major storm events occur. You have about a 30 to 40% savings in damages or costs that now aren't realized. So and we also know that for every dollar invested into flood preparedness or adaptation along the lines of that which I just described, over a 10-year period, for $1 invested in flood risk mitigation, we realize, depending on the area and the action, between $3 and $8 in savings in flood damage that now doesn't occur. So the return on investment to be proactive and ahead of the curve is tremendous in this case, per 10-year period. And by the way, it's difficult to calculate the return on investment associated with adaptation because quite frankly, it's the gift that keeps on giving. Once you put measures in place to mitigate flood risk or fire risk or any other form of risk, basically not only do you save the next time the major event occurs in reference to damage that now didn't occur, but you save the time after that, the time after that, the time after that. It's the gift that keeps on giving, so to speak. And also, every dollar that is spent on adaptation, the benefits associated with that dollar are realized locally versus distally. In other words, sometimes people say, well, when we're talking about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, the benefits accrue to the global commons. And if China's not going to do it or India's not going to do it, why are we doing it? You know, so that argument exists. However, on adaptation, it does not apply. If you spend $10 in a local town or neighborhood or wherever it is around your house to mitigate flood risk, you get the benefits locally, independent of what's happening globally.
All right. The second question, Blair, was around your costs of basement flooding. Would there be merit in moving towards building houses that do not have basements?
Yeah, so increasingly so, there is discussion of that in the country, and indeed some are being built as such. But disproportionately, we work a lot with the Canadian Home Builders Association, like almost daily, and people want basements. That's the reality. So the question is, how do we build basement? There's nothing wrong with having a basement as long as you build it with the features and characteristics in place to make it such that when the big storms hit, you don't flood out. And by the way, it starts with don't build on a floodplain. So so is there merit in having homes without basements? The answer is yes, but disproportionately so. People lean in the direction of they want the basement, but They want the measures in place to make it such that they're not going to realize flooding.
Just a question about the flood protection courses. Is there a cost associated with those?
Through the professional associations, the answer is no. If there's no cost, and indeed for our organization, and by the way, let me get back to you on that, but the answer is no. And but one of the people on our team is the expert on this, and if for people on the call here, if they're interested, I can find out and then send you the information how they sign up to take that course. And I'm 96% sure that it's free.
All right, two more quick ones. Did your suggestions include ways that lifestyle changes would reduce the negative effects of precipitation?
That is probably more in the camp of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and carbon capture and sequestration. So, and by the way, in this country right now, in Canada, 90% or something like that of the discussion of climate change still focuses on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. That's where the energy efficiency initiatives, et cetera, lowering carbon footprint, all of which, by the way, I agree with. But it's only adaptation to climate change is really, it's sort of like the distant cousin that nobody wants to talk about. It's only in the last couple of years that adaptation is really coming into being. And we're embracing it to mitigate flood risk, fire risk, et cetera, because we're realizing this stuff is not going away. But mostly in terms of lifestyle changes, I would say that that's more in the camp of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions.
All right, and the final question comes from one of our planning partners at Grey County. She's wondering if there are any opportunities to offer the flood training to municipal staff that are involved in reviewing development applications, so planners, engineers, et cetera.
Yeah, 100%. If you send the invite, and I will send the person who will do the training for free.
Amazing.
Yeah.
All right. I hate to cut the conversation short. There may be other questions that I've missed in the chat, but we can address those after the fact if needed. Thank you so much, Blair. I'm seeing a ton of very positive comments in the chat as well. So thank you very much for your time. I know you're a busy man, and we appreciate you dedicating some time to speak to us today.
If I could add just one more very, very brief point, because I know we're out of time, but this is the #1 directive that needs to be embraced for Canada. If you're a Minister of the Environment, said tomorrow, what's the #1 thing I should do as Minister of the Environment? It's to launch a national home flood protection education program. Canadians will act if they know what to do. The problem is right now they don't know what to do to protect their home. And but this is the most solvable issue that can be deployed readily with no special expertise for next to no money. This is the greatest bang for the buck by far that Canada can realize in terms of addressing climate change and extreme weather risk. And by the way, this doesn't just benefit wealthy homeowners. This is also for people who live in basements, that if those basements flood, they find themselves on the street. Well, this benefits them as well. We don't want to have flooding for either homeowners and or renters. So this should be at the very, very top of the list of actions that can be embraced starting this weekend. There's nothing to hold us back on doing this.